of circumstances, did know more than it seemed anybody else knew. Basically, the entire industry was culpable, and you could probably go as far as to argue that the entire corporate world was in some way implicated, certainly because of the way the corporations work and the way big business and the way high capitalism actually works.
Right.
So there was nobody really left out of this. So it's not that I don't want to single out Monsanto, because Monsanto did a lot of really stupid things, which I personally think ended up bringing the company down, or at least damaging the company, because people were just sticking their heads in the sand. They were in denial. In the 70s and the 80s, it was incredible to see how much industry was in denial, in much the same way that everybody, and I mean everybody, is in denial over climate change. So it's easier to say without making it complicated, and without getting into the specifics, that dioxin is quite simply a killer. And people knew as far back as the turn of the 20th century, back in the 1920s, they knew it was a killer. They certainly knew it was a killer in the 1940s. And the reason that it got used as a chemical weapon is because it was a killer. It's not the only killer out there, but for some reason it was the one which was identified mostly. And it was probably simply because the industry itself always knew how dangerous, how deadly it actually was. And everybody's implicated. The German chemical industry, the French chemical industry, the Swiss chemical industry, not just the Americans. And to a certain extent as well, there are certain countries that have not come out of this with a great deal of credit. Australia were terrible in how they dealt with this. I mean, people think of this as just the Americans and what they did and what their chemical industry did as well. But it wasn't just them. It was global, and it was fairly frightening. But needless to say, probably the reason why dioxin became such a biggie was because of the way groups like Greenpeace worked on it and worked on what they were doing. But they were culpable as far as I'm concerned as well, because they were basically trying to scare people, and that doesn't work. You don't turn around to someone, scare the living daylights of them, and say, oh, by the way, can you give us some money so that I can stay on my job? So you know, very, 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 very few people in this come out without any credit. The only people who come out with credit are the communities who doggedly stuck to their tasks and tried to prove something which I've always argued you can't do. You cannot have a community, no matter how large, that cannot be expected to suddenly start learning all these different disciplines, all these different skills and talents and so forth. You know, they can't become toxicologists overnight yet. In fact, that's exactly what did happen. And they did, and to this day there's probably people running around communities that know more about the toxicology of something like dioxin than people who call themselves toxicologists.
Well, I can equate to that as far as the major green groups are concerned, because when at the height of our campaign here in Kevin Maher against the Monsanto chemical factory, we initially approached Greenpeace and they didn't want to know. In fact, the doctor there we spoke to said, I'm much too busy, can you sort of send us a check, and words to that nature. So they didn't really want to know. They wanted us to join. They wanted money from us, and we were on our own, which we were glad, because we learnt a lot that way. And coming to your latest book, Robert, about the dioxin impact on the Vietnamese people, what do you get into in this book?
To be honest with you, I don't know why I got into it. I ended up writing a book called The Dioxin War, which I won't say it got suppressed, but let's put it this way, it's not very high up in the old radar. And it's probably, the reason for this is because the book itself is too technical. I went in, I think, too deep into the history of dioxin. And to be honest with you, it's not the sort of book, you know, you're going to give anyone as a Christmas present, because it's just not the right kind of book for that. I did all this work, did all this research, and kind of felt that there was a human interest story in this that was getting left out for lots of different reasons. So I was always aware of what was happening in Vietnam, because dioxin was the contaminant, the major contaminant of the chemical weapons that the US military used during the so-called Vietnamese War, which in fact it's more accurately known as the American War, because it was the Americans who actually declared war in the first place, even though it was done supposedly at the behest of the so-called Democratic Southern Vietnamese Republic, and of course the Northern Vietnamese weren't having this and got involved. And the Americans knew from the very beginning that they were in trouble, and they also knew that they could use this particular weapon. And again, this is, if you think the denial about dioxin is bad in the Western world or the Northern Hemisphere, it's nothing compared to what's actually happened in Vietnam. And at the time, the Vietnamese, and they will tell you this today, people who were nurses, people who were soldiers, people who were involved as couriers, mostly along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which stretched all the way from Hanoi down towards what is now Ho Chi Minh City, which was then called Saigon. A lot of people became exposed, and they had no idea what had happened to them. They just found, as they got older, one particular woman who was a nurse in the middle of the country. She found herself having miscarriage after miscarriage. Other people started getting various different cancers. The same sort of symptoms and the same sort of diseases and the same sort of illnesses that were afflicting people in other places. And of course, for years the Vietnamese were ignored, simply because in America the people who were affected by this, of course, were the American soldiers who'd been out in Vietnam, and they had been exposed as well because of the way it was used. Not only did the American government at the time and the American state know exactly what it was letting itself in for, and it didn't seem to care. It didn't seem to matter to it that it was going to poison its own soldiers. Of course, for years there was this denial that, oh, we didn't know it was this toxic, and we didn't know this and didn't know that. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but they did. They knew exactly how toxic it was, to the extent that the dioxin contaminant in, and I won't go into the details of what it is, but basically it was a herbicide, and it was used. And the reason why dioxin became such a big issue is because this particular herbicide was used on so-called unwanted vegetation. So of course, this is how the U.S. military decided to use it. The idea was that it would destroy the forest cover. But of course they knew damn rightly that one of the things that they could also do with it was to destroy the Vietnamese food supply. And to do that meant they had to have a stronger, it had to have a stronger component, meaning that it had to be more toxic, and therefore to make it more toxic it had to have more dioxin in it. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. I'm just trying to remember here exactly.
So we're talking about the Agent Orange 245T, aren't we?
Well, no, what it was it was. I may give an example. There was Agent Orange, which was 50/50, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, two herbicides. Then there was pink, which was just 2,4,5-T, and then there was purple, which was 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, but purple wasn't as strong as orange, for example.
I see.
There's a guy called, what's his name? There was a scientist, I can't remember his name. He was an Air Force scientist in Vietnam, and he actually ended up reporting to Congress many years later, and he said we were aware. I think he said we were aware of the potential for damage due to dioxin contamination in the herbicide. We were even aware that the military formulation, that is the batches that were given to the U.S. military by the U.S. chemical industry, had a higher dioxin concentration than the version that was used and sold to the public. So this was blatantly this was deliberate.
Yeah, of course, this dioxin contamination has passed up through the generations in Vietnam, and we're seeing some horrendous pictures of birth defects, misshaped skulls and misshaped faces, limbs, etc. It's actually horrendous now. That's caused by the dioxin contamination.
Well, see, it passes through. If you're lucky to have, I mean, this may sound as I'm getting this wrong. If you're lucky to have miscarriages, you're all right. But if you're not lucky to have miscarriages, if it's in your body, it will pass through the placenta into your children at that particular stage. So therefore, many people were directly exposed during the war, and then they passed that exposure on to their children. So that was the first level of exposure, and of course once it's passed on,